Something dark is happening on the border Finland shares with Russia. While Russian President Vladimir Putin continues his invasion of Ukraine, he seems to be setting his sights on the future. A future that may involve a military campaign launched against Finland so Russia can retake control of the territory that it lost decades ago. Finland must prepare. To do that, it's keeping a close eye on what Russia is doing close to its borders. Now it's letting the world know what's happening, and it's also taking actions that could leave Putin in for a rude awakening if he decides to take the next step and launch a direct military campaign against the Finns. On April 15, Finland's Deputy Chief of the Defence Command, Lieutenant General Vesa Virtanen, spoke with a German media outlet, Die Welt. He claimed that Finland has been tracking Russia as it builds a ton of new military infrastructure across the border the two countries share. What's the purpose of this infrastructure? Virtanen says Russia intends to place more soldiers there shortly. When Russia is finished with Ukraine, that is, when they can withdraw their forces from the Ukrainian border, then they'll come to our border, the Finnish defense chief told the German outlet. He also pointed out that Russia is already causing plenty of havoc on that border even before it amasses forces. Russia has been testing Article 5 all the time with mass migration, cyber attacks, GPS disruptions, and information and disinformation campaigns, the general claims. Virtanen is referring to the Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which lies at the heart of the Cooperative Defence Alliance. Under Article 5, an armed attack against any NATO member is considered an attack against all of the group's members. Think of it like an all-for-one and one-for-all strategy. An enemy of NATO risks the entire group's wrath if it wants to attack an individual member. Russia is pushing the limits of that article with its most recent actions. Right now, Virtanen says Russia is erecting new equipment it can use to station Russian troops on the border. During the war, there are about 20,000 soldiers stationed and about 4 standby brigades, he says. Now we see that Russia is building new infrastructure and, as soon as they can, more troops in this region. The result, he says, is that there will soon be more troops on the border than there were before Putin launched his Ukraine invasion. That's a major worry for Finland. And it's such a massive worry, not just because of the extra troops, but because this is far from the first example of Russian border activity. Rewind to September 2023, when there was already emerging evidence of a border buildup. That month saw YLE obtain satellite images demonstrating that Russia had quickly built 3 large buildings in the wilderness separating it from Finland. Those bases, which were close to the Alakurti base that is just 31 miles from the Finnish border, have since become the home of Russia's 80th Separate Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade, YLE says. Russia also built a new military storage site about 108 miles from the border in 2023. That build-up showcased a new form of construction Russia has started using to create bases quickly. The country creates a lightweight metal frame onto which it places a plastic-coated fabric roof to hide whatever goes into the structure away from view. This type of construction isn't strong enough to stop enemy missiles or drones, but for the purpose of creating a threat toward a nation that it knows isn't going to start a war with Russia, it's ideal for Putin's purpose of creating an ever-present threat. Since those initial structures went up, Russia has built a new hangar measuring almost 13,500 square feet, which is large enough to hold up to 50 armored vehicles. It's also built a facility it can use to repair military equipment, alongside a tent camp where the soldiers it intends to amass on the Finnish border can stay. These are all signs, says Virtanen, that Russia has some diabolical plans in store. Right now, the troops and equipment stored in these buildings seem to be dedicated to Ukraine. However, if that war ends in Putin's favor, the structures won't just disappear, they'll remain, likely with their soldiers and equipment, to present a threat to Finland. And if Putin isn't satisfied with expanding his influence into Ukraine, these new border facilities could become the launching point of an invasion deeper into Europe. An invasion that could start with Finland. It could be argued that Putin has already started a war with Finland, at least on the non-traditional front. Beyond this border build-up, Virtanen noted that mass migration, cyber attacks and GPS jamming across the border are becoming increasingly common. All are forms of hybrid warfare, and all are tools that Putin uses to try and weaken the nations upon which he sets his sights. Migration is a particular problem for Finland. In April 2024, Finland announced that it would be closing its borders to all Russian immigrants indefinitely. The decision followed a series of closures and reopenings during the first half of 2024, indicating that this was a decision that Finland didn't want to make. It acted out of necessity. Why? Russia was using the instrumentalization of migrants as a way to damage Finland. The country's interior minister, Vesa Virtanen, explained her country's decision. Finnish authorities see this as a long-term situation, she said. We have not seen anything this spring that would lead us to conclude that the situation has changed meaningfully. In other words, Russia was still sending floods of migrants in Finland's direction, forcing the permanent border closure. A couple of months later, Finland officially passed a law granting its border guards the ability to block all asylum seekers from Russia. The move came after more than 1,300 people arrived from Russia in Finland, with many of those migrants coming from countries like Somalia and Syria. Typically, those immigrants are tempted to move by Russia, which then funnels them through Belarus and toward Finland. The bill passed with 167 votes against 31. Russia, of course, claimed that there was no ill intention behind this migration. Finland knew better. Russia uses mass and uncontrolled migration tactics to force a desperate flow of refugees into Europe. The Hoover Institution says that these tactics lead to a growing far-right and anti-immigrant views forming in the countries that Russia targets, which is part of the weaponization aspect. Russia hopes that by creating political chaos using migration as a lever, it can then manipulate those countries into being less effective opponents to Putin's objectives. In Finland's case, its decision to adopt new laws to prevent the flow of migrants from Russia created some criticism within the European Union, or EU, which is precisely what Putin wanted. Division, even over an issue over which Finland should have full control, only creates more turmoil. Russia weakens a strong political union through its migration tactics. It forced Finland into the difficult decision between protecting its borders and keeping its EU allies happy. And that's not all Russia is doing to damage Finland's border integrity. Virtanen also mentioned cyber attacks, and we can lump other acts of sabotage and disruption into that category. In October 2024, Finland's intelligence services reported a defined uptick in the number of hostile activities in which Russia was engaging throughout the Euro-Atlantic region. Beyond the already mentioned migration, these activities included repeated cyber attacks and even arson that can be linked to Moscow. Finland's Minister of Transport, Communications and the Interior, Lulu Ran, outlined the problem at the time. We're experiencing disruptions, acts of sabotage, various types of damage, and instrumentalized migration, among other things, she claimed. As for who was behind all of those actions, based on the information from both civilian and military intelligence, we have clear indications pointing to Russia. On the cybersecurity front, Finland has faced 10 large attacks between 2022 and 2024, most of which can be linked to Russia. For instance, April 2023 saw a pro-Russian hacking group called No Name 05716 launch a large hacking campaign that affected several Finnish parliamentary websites immediately after Finland became a NATO member. Unknown hackers have also launched multiple distributed denial of service or DDoS attacks against Finland over the last few years. A DDoS attack involves a hacker overwhelming a website with traffic from as many sources as possible, crashing the site and making it inaccessible to legitimate users. One such attack, launched in February 2024, was traced back to the same hacking group that hit Finland's parliamentary sites the previous April. Other attacks, such as one coordinated against the finance platform Raft, saw unknown hackers steal $3.3 million. In short, Finland has a cybersecurity problem, and it looks like Russia lies at the heart of it, just as it does with the migration issue and the more recent military buildups on the border. There's also the GPS jamming that Virtanen mentions. Ran also highlighted these types of attacks, which she says Russia uses to target maritime and aerial tracking. YLE also notes that there's been a definite increase in these types of attacks against Finland since February 2022, with Russia again suspected as the main culprit. The problem is so extensive that 3 airports in the eastern part of Finland, which is the side where it shares a border with Russia, have gone back to using radio navigation equipment to guide planes in for landing. Several Finnish vessels sailing through the Black Sea have also experienced malfunctions in their navigational systems. Those malfunctions are dangerous. They force the ships to stray away from their intended routes, raising the possibility of accidents. An accident hasn't occurred yet, but the fact that Russia is using these types of tactics is a sign that Putin already believes he's at war with Finland. The latest buildup of military facilities on the border is just the latest extension of a campaign that's been going on for years. Finland is at least trying to counter this GPS jamming issue. Researchers from the National Land Survey of Finland say that they're working on a device that will allow them to detect jamming attempts in real time. The device could then deliver warnings to the affected ships and aircraft, in addition to potentially alerting Finland to the origin of the jamming attack. Still, that device isn't available yet, meaning Finland will need to absorb more of these jamming efforts until it is. And that leads to a question. Russia is clearly turning itself into a threat against Finland with these border buildups and hybrid warfare tactics. But why is it doing all of this? Finland's decision to join NATO plays a huge role in Putin's issue with the country. Russia's leader announced the creation of the Leningrad military district close to the border with Finland in the immediate aftermath of that NATO decision, which was the starting point behind the more intense border buildups we've seen since. Of course, Putin denies that his actions are motivated by Finland's NATO decision. He's dismissed such actions as complete nonsense in the past, while adding that Russia has no desire to engage in any sort of conflict with a NATO-aligned nation. But, as is so often the case, what Putin says and what he's doing are two very different things. After all, this is the same man who threatened to strengthen Russia's forces in the Baltic region, including potentially deploying nuclear weapons to the exclave of Kaliningrad back in April 2022. That threat was made when Finland and Sweden were both working to become NATO members, with Putin's message being clear: join NATO and Russia will point its nukes at you. Russia may not have fully followed up on that threat. However, it's clear that Putin feels threatened by Finland being part of NATO. Everything he's doing on the border now is a response to Finland's decision, in addition to being Russia's way of laying the groundwork for a possible future confrontation. It's also hard to ignore the fact that Finland is doing everything that it can to support Ukraine in its fight against Putin's forces. In February, Finland announced that it would deliver $691 million of military equipment to Ukraine, with most of that hardware coming from Finland's domestic defense industry. No information about specific equipment was provided, outside Finland saying it would deliver based on Ukraine's critical needs, with the money also being divided across multiple future aid packages. The move also marked a new approach from Finland. Where it had previously only donated from its surplus stock, this latest batch of aid sees the country ordering new military products that it then delivers to Ukraine. A news release marking the announcement stated, "With this new support program, Finnish companies and expertise will play a central role in supporting Ukraine. These measures will strengthen both Ukraine's chance for a just peace and the long-term resilience of Finland's security industry and supply chain." The program will also anger Putin. Combine it with Finland's NATO decision, and you start to see a clear logic behind the Russian president's border buildup and hybrid warfare strategies. He sees Finland as a growing threat, and one that Russia needs to counter sooner rather than later. Which leads to another question. How is Finland responding to Russian border buildup? It's countering Putin's moves with plenty of its own, to show Russia's leader that it can't be intimidated into submitting to his will. One of Finland's moves is the very action that sparks so much of Russia's aggression in the first place, its decision to join NATO. That wasn't a choice Finland made lightly. For decades, the country maintained a neutral stance on most global affairs. That's the approach the Finns had followed since the end of World War II, with Putin's actions in Ukraine pushing it into changing tack. The country's former Prime Minister, Alexander Stubb, made that clear when he said Finland's decision to join NATO was a done deal the moment that Putin crossed the border into Ukraine. And it had to be. Finland has a long history with Russia, including having its territory invaded by the Soviet Union in late 1939 as World War II got underway. To avoid a full-blown occupation, Finland had to give up 10% of its territory to get the Soviets off its collective back. Putin's actions in Ukraine serve as a dreadful reminder of Russian expansionism. Joining NATO was the natural response. Worse yet for Putin, Finland hasn't joined NATO to make up the numbers while relying on the organisation's more powerful members such as the US, UK and France to defend it. Finland has taken a very active role. As the BBC notes, the country conscripts 21,000 people per year and has a massive reserve force of 900,000. In wartime, that amounts to the country having an active military of 280,000. Far less than Russia, but more than enough to put up a respectable fight. Finland also established itself as an important country early in its NATO membership. It had been a partner of the group since 1994. Joining was an action supported by most of the population, with 89% stating they were happy with the decision, according to the Wilson Centre. In its first year of membership, Finland was among relatively few NATO members that exceeded the organisation's recommended benchmark of 2% of gross domestic product or GDP spending on defence. Finland spent 2.3% of its GDP on defence in 2024. It's also played a key role in helping to host the Nordic arm of NATO's Steadfast Defender operation, which is the largest military exercise NATO has carried out in decades. The country is also attending important meetings and taking part in cybersecurity training led by other NATO members. In short, it's making sure NATO knows that it intends to participate as much as it can. Putin is paying attention to that, and all he can do is watch as Finland's ties with its NATO's allies grow stronger in response to his threats and military build-ups. Defence spending is another area through which Finland is showing Russia that it's very serious about protecting its territory. If Finland's exceeding its NATO spending targets during its first year as a member was impressive, its commitment over the coming years is outstanding. The country had pledged to raise defence spending each year between 2025 and 2029, reaching 3% of its GDP by the last year. That works out to around $30 billion of additional funding being dedicated to the country's defence over the next decade. Granted, that may not seem like a lot compared to the US, which spends nearly $1 trillion in defence annually. However, for a small country like Finland, it's a massive spending commitment. Adding to that budget increase is Finland's decision to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention. That convention bans the use of anti-personnel landmines, meaning Finland's exit could indicate one of the methods it intends to use to guard its border with Russia. Lacing its land with mines just behind the border would be enough to cause some serious damage to an invading Russian force. If nothing else, it would push that Russian force into slowing down, giving Finland more time to prepare. And given that Finland accounts for around 800 miles of the border that Europe collectively shares with Russia, it makes sense that it'll do everything it can to make its defences as dangerous as possible. But it's not just landmines Finland is considering using. It's also taking an approach to its border that highlights how serious it is about keeping Russia out. Finland is building a wall. That wall won't cover the entire border. As Militani points out, it's intended to be about 125 miles long. However, Finland's concern over Russia's military build-up appears to have lit a fire under the country, leading it to being several months ahead of schedule on the wall's construction as of February 2025. That means most of the wall will be finished by the end of 2025, with only a handful of sections left to wrap up the following year. Given that the wall wasn't meant to be finished until the end of 2026, with construction beginning in April 2023, that's a pretty impressive increase in pace. Granted, it's not the most imposing wall in the world. The barrier is just 3 meters high and is made using a combination of steel mesh and barbed wire. However, Finland is also equipping its border guards with spotlights and video surveillance equipment, meaning the wall will act as an early warning system in the event of a Russian invasion. Finland has dedicated over $110 million to the construction efforts. The odds are that it will consider building even more barriers across the rest of its border once it has them in place for the country's most vulnerable areas. Taken together, these moves send a clear signal. Putin has some dark plans for Finland, even if those plans only extend to intimidating the country into doing what he wants. But Finland sees through those plans, and its own military build-up, combined with the reinforcement of its border defences and its increasingly active role in NATO, delivers a strong message to Putin. Finland will be ready, no matter what Russia does next. But what do you think about Russia's border activities and Finland's response? Is Putin thinking about invading Finland if he wins the war in Ukraine? How well do you think Finland will defend itself, taking into account that it's a NATO member? Share your thoughts with us in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more commentary on Russia's latest moves in Europe. We're an independent source of news and information about military conflicts around the globe, and very much appreciate your support.